The morning Gertrude Reed walked into the Callen County land office. She had already rehearsed every word she intended to say, but nothing she had rehearsed could have prepared her for the laughter that followed. It was the spring of 1878, and the Kansas plains stretched wide and golden in every direction, a land so vast and so indifferent to human ambition that a person either broke beneath its weight or grew iron in their spine just trying to survive it. Gertrude had been surviving for 3 years on a homestead claim her father had staked before the fever took him the previous winter, and she had kept every acre of that land alive through drought and cold, and the particular loneliness of a woman working alone with nothing but a mule named Chester, and a stubbornness that ran so deep in her blood, she sometimes thought it was the only thing keeping her heart beating. She had driven the wagon 12 miles into the town of Harlow that morning. The roads were still soft from 2 days of April rain, and Chester had been difficult about the mud, so she arrived later than she had intended, with the hem of her brown wool skirt darkened from a splash she had taken crossing Riddle Creek. She tied Chester at the post outside the land office, smoothed her hair beneath her bonnet, and pushed open the door with her chin held at a height that told the world she had every right to be there. The land office was a narrow room with a pine counter running across its middle, and a row of surveyor's maps pinned to the back wall behind it. Behind the counter stood Harmon Briggs, the county land agent, a round-faced man in his 50s with spectacles that sat perpetually low on his nose, and a manner that suggested he had been appointed to his position by someone who owed him a favor rather than by any genuine qualification. Beside him stood his assistant, a thin young man named Elroy Potts, who was copying numbers into a ledger, and who looked up when Gertrude entered with the vague, dismissive expression of a person who has already decided you are wasting his time. There were 2 other men in the room, ranchers by the look of them, waiting on chairs along the side wall with their hats balanced on their knees, and they all looked at Gertrude when she walked in. She stepped up to the counter. "Good morning," she said clearly. "My name is Gertrude Reed. My father was Thomas Reed, who filed a homestead claim on Section 14 of the Eastern Parcel under the Homestead Act of 1862. He passed away in February. I am here to petition the office to transfer the claim to my name and to file for the final patent on the land, as I have been working it continuously and have met the 5-year residency requirement." Harmon Briggs looked at her over his spectacles for a long moment. Then he smiled. It was not a kind smile. It was the smile of a man who finds something amusing that he intends to share with everyone around him whether or not they asked for the joke. "Miss Reed," he said, drawing out her name as though it were itself a punchline, "a woman cannot hold a homestead claim independently. The law requires the head of household to be either a citizen of 21 years or older or the widow of a Union soldier." "I am 26 years old," Gertrude said, keeping her voice flat and even, "and I am aware that single women are permitted to file claims under the Homestead Act." "I have read the legislation, Mr. Briggs." "You have read it," Briggs repeated, and then Elroy Potts made a small sound that was unmistakably a smothered laugh. One of the ranchers along the wall shifted in his seat, and she could see from the corner of her eye that his lips were pressed together against a grin. "I have," she said, "and you believe you understand it." "I believe I understand it correctly, yes." Briggs leaned on the counter and shook his head in the slow, theatrical way of a man performing patience for an audience. "Miss Reed, I am going to explain this to you simply. Your father's claim was made in his name. It was his claim. Now your father has passed, God rest him, and the claim reverts to the county unless it can be transferred to a male relative or a legitimate husband. You got a brother, an uncle." "I have neither," Gertrude said. "And the act does not state what you are describing. The act explicitly permits women who are heads of household to—" "The act," Briggs said, and now he was no longer bothering to hide his amusement, "is a piece of federal paper that I am responsible for interpreting in this county. And in this county, a woman alone does not have the standing to hold title to 160 acres of land. You know why. He glanced at the two ranchers along the wall, a look that invited them into the joke. Because what happens when somebody comes riding up to make trouble on your land? You going to fight them off with a soup ladle? The room erupted. Both ranchers laughed, broad and open, the kind of laughter that fills a room because it is permitted to fill a room, because the person being laughed at does not have the authority to stop it. Elroy Potts actually put down his pen so he could laugh more freely. Briggs himself chuckled in that self-satisfied way that made Gertrude's hands curl into fists at her sides beneath the counter where no one could see them. She stood still. She waited for the laughter to run its course, the way you wait out a rainstorm when there is no shelter within reach. Then she said, in a voice that was so steady it seemed almost miraculous even to her, "I see. Thank you for your time." She turned and walked out. She did not let herself breathe until she was through the door and standing on the wooden sidewalk outside. And even then she kept her face composed, because there was a man leaning against the post where Chester was tied, and she was not going to weep in front of a stranger if she could help it. But she could still hear the laughter through the walls of the land office, rolling on even after she had left, and it hit her somewhere behind her sternum like a fist, because she had not come 12 miles through mud to be laughed at. She had come 12 miles because the land was her father's dream, and it was her home, and she had planted winter wheat in that soil, and buried a dog she loved in the corner of the north field, and she was not going to let Harmon Briggs take it from her with his spectacles, and his smug interpretation of a law he did not fully understand. She pressed her fingers against her mouth for a moment and looked out at the street, at the dust and the horses and the ordinary morning business of Harlow, Kansas, going on as though nothing had happened. "I heard everything," said a voice beside her. "Come with me." She turned. The man leaning against the post was taller than she had registered at first, the kind of tall that made itself known gradually, like a door frame you only notice after you have nearly walked into it. He was lean in the way that outdoor work makes a man lean, not thin but compacted, all of it useful. He wore a dark blue shirt with the sleeves rolled to the elbows, leather gloves tucked into his belt, and a hat the color of dust that had been broken in so thoroughly it sat on his head like it had always been there. He looked to be somewhere near 30, with dark brown eyes and a jaw that had not been introduced to a razor in about 4 days, and a mouth that, at this particular moment, was set in an expression of careful seriousness. "I beg your pardon," Gertrude said. "I was outside the whole time," he said. "The windows are single pane and Harmon Briggs has a voice that carries. I heard what you said in there, and I heard what he said back to you, and I am telling you he is wrong." She looked at him for a moment, calculating whether this was some other kind of trouble, some other man with some other angle. "Who are you?" she asked. "Dexter Ramsey," he said, and he offered his hand in the direct, uncomplicated way of someone who is not trying to impress anyone. "I run cattle on the Ramsey spread about 7 miles north of here. I have also, as it happens, spent a fair amount of time reading land law because I have been in disputes of my own with this county over water rights, so I know the act better than Harmon Briggs wishes I did." He paused. He was wrong. A woman who is head of household can absolutely file. Clara McBride did it 4 years ago right here in this county, and she got her patent. Gertrude stared at him. "You know this," she said. "I know it. And you know where to find evidence of it." "I know where to find a lawyer who does," he said. "His name is Warren Aldis. He keeps an office above the hardware store on Clement Street. He is honest, which in my experience is not as common a quality as one might hope, and he knows federal land law well enough to make Harmon Briggs sit down and stop performing for his audience." She looked at this man, Dexter Ramsey, and she tried to find the ulterior motive in his face and could not locate one. His expression was straightforward and calm, and there was something in his eyes that was not pity, which she would not have been able to tolerate, but was instead something more like indignation on her behalf, a clean anger at an injustice witnessed. "Why?" she asked. He seemed mildly surprised by the question, as though he had not considered that it would require answering. "Because you went in there and made a reasonable legal argument and a grown man with a government position laughed at you for it," he said. "Because that is not right, and because I can help." She considered him for another moment. Then she looked at Chester, who had turned his large, philosophically indifferent head toward her as if to weigh in on the matter. "All right," she said. "Show me to Mr. Aldous." He pushed off from the post and started walking, and Gertrude fell into step beside him, holding her skirt clear of the mud at the edge of the sidewalk, keeping her chin at that same height it had been when she walked into the land office. "Your mule will be fine at that post," Dexter said as they turned the corner. "Nobody will bother him. Chester is very good at discouraging people from bothering him," she said. He glanced at her sideways, and for the first time that morning she saw the edges of a smile move across his face, brief and genuine. "Good name for a mule," he said. She almost smiled back. Almost. Warren Aldous was a small, compact man of about 50 with a neatly trimmed mustache and the organized, efficient manner of someone who has made his peace with spending his working hours in a room full of paper. His office was indeed above the hardware store, reached by a narrow staircase that smelled of sawdust and linseed oil, and when Dexter knocked and pushed the door open, Aldous looked up from his desk with the air of a man who is not entirely surprised to see trouble arriving on a Tuesday morning. "Dexter," he said. "And who is this?" "Gertrude Reed," Dexter said. "Thomas Reed's daughter. She's got a homestead situation and Harmon Briggs just made a fool of himself in front of witnesses." Aldous put down his pen. "Tell me," so Gertrude told him. She laid it out in precise, organized language, the claim number, the filing date, her father's death in February, the 5 years of continuous improvement and residence, and then exactly what Briggs had said to her and the legal argument she had made in response. She did not embellish it and she did not leave anything out, and when she was finished Aldous sat back in his chair and rubbed his jaw. "He told you that a woman cannot hold a claim independently," Aldous said. "He did." "And did he cite any specific statute?" "He did not. He spoke of his interpretation." Aldous looked at Dexter. "His interpretation." "He said it the way a person says a word they have found in an unexpected and unpleasant location." "That is what I said," Dexter confirmed. "The Act of 1862 is plain," Aldous said, leaning forward now, picking up his pen with a certain purposeful energy. "Section 2. Any person who is the head of a family or who has arrived at the age of 21 years and is a citizen of the United States shall be entitled to enter 1/4 section of unappropriated public lands." He looked at Gertrude. "Person. The Act says person, Miss Reed. Congress specifically argued over this and the word was chosen deliberately to include women. Clara McBride, 1874, right here in this county." Briggs himself processed that claim. "He did," Gertrude said. "Under pressure from my office," Aldous said with a dry satisfaction. "Which means he knows very well that his interpretation this morning was not an interpretation at all. It was a performance." The anger in Gertrude's chest reorganized itself from something hot and formless into something sharper and more useful. "What do I do?" she asked. "You come back here this afternoon with your father's original filing documents, any receipts of improvements you can find, and any neighbors who might testify to your continuous residence, and we will put together a formal petition that will make Harmon Briggs wish he had chosen a different Tuesday to be theatrical in his land office." Aldous wrote something on a piece of paper and slid it toward her. "That is the list of what you need. Can you be back by 2 o'clock? "Yes," she said. She stood and shook his hand, and then she turned and found Dexter standing just behind her, his hat in his hands, and she realized he had been there the whole time, quiet and steady at her back, not inserting himself into the conversation but simply present. "Thank you," she said to him, meaning it fully. "Did you drive in today?" he asked. "I did, Chester and the wagon. The road back will be worse this afternoon after the sun's been working on it. You have a friend in town you could wait with." She thought about this. She knew the Greer family, who ran the dry goods store, but she would not call herself close to any of them. "I will manage," she said. He nodded once as if he had expected that answer and respected it. "I have business at the feed store that will keep me until noon. If you want company for the ride home after you meet with Aldous, I can take you as far as the Eastern Road. My property runs alongside your father's land on the north side." She had not known that. She studied him again, reassessing. "The Ramsey spread," she said. "That's right. I did not realize we were neighbors." "We are," he said simply. "Which means I have a practical interest in seeing you keep your land, as well as a general human interest in justice being done." It was the most honest thing anyone had said to her in a very long time, and she did not quite know what to do with it, so she looked out the window at the street below instead. "I accept your offer," she said. 2 o'clock with Aldous and I will find you after." He told her where to look for him, named the feed store on the far side of the main street, put his hat back on his head, and went down the stairs. She stood at the top of the staircase for a moment and listened to his boots on the steps and then on the street below. And she thought that, in a single morning, her understanding of what was possible had shifted in a direction she had not anticipated when she drove through the mud crossing Riddle Creek. She went back to the wagon and retrieved the small wooden box from beneath the seat where she kept the important papers, then drove Chester to the livery for water while she spent the next 2 hours going through every document in that box, organizing them with the careful precision of someone who has learned not to waste a second chance. She found the original filing receipt, signed by her father and dated June 15, 1873. She found the timber culture records, the well-digging receipts, the letter from the county surveyor confirming the boundary stakes. She found a personal letter her father had written to the land office in 1875 confirming continued residence and improvement, still bearing the office's received stamp. She arranged everything in order, made a list on a piece of paper she borrowed from the liveryman, and at 5 minutes before 2 o'clock, she climbed the stairs above the hardware store again. Aldous took 90 minutes to review everything, asking questions that were precise and probing, and Gertrude answered each one. When they were finished, he stacked the papers with the neat authority of a man who has won arguments before and intends to win this one. And he told her that he would present the formal petition to the land office by the end of the week, and that if Briggs attempted to refuse it, they would appeal directly to the Federal Land Commissioner's office in Topeka. "He will not enjoy that," Aldous said. "He values his position enormously, and a federal review of his office's procedures would be deeply uncomfortable for him." "Good," Gertrude said, and Aldous looked at her over his own spectacles, which sat high and correctly on his nose unlike Briggs's, and smiled. "Good indeed," he agreed. She paid him a fee she had been hoarding from egg sales since January and went downstairs and out into the afternoon. The sky had gone from pale morning blue to a deeper, richer shade, and the street smelled of horses and spring mud and the faint sweetness of cottonwood along the creek. She found Dexter at the feed store just as he was loading the last of several sacks into the bed of a wagon larger and sturdier than hers, and he looked up when she approached. "How did it go?" he asked. "He is filing the petition by end of week," she said. "He said if Briggs refuses, we go to Topeka." Something moved across Dexter's face. It was not quite a smile. It was more like satisfaction, the kind that runs quiet and deep. "Good," he said. He secured the last sack and dusted off his hands. "You ready to head back?" "Yes." They rode out of Harlow side by side, her wagon and his, Chester plodding with resigned dignity through the ruts, and Dexter's 2 horses moving with the easy, practiced gait of animals that know their road. The afternoon sun was warm on the left side of Gertrude's face, and the prairie spread itself out around them in the particular way it had in mid-April, where the grass was that young, sharp green that it only holds for 2 weeks before the summer bleaches it toward gold. For a while they rode without talking, and the silence was comfortable in a way that surprised her. Then Dexter said, "How long have you been working the land alone?" "My father took ill in November," she said. "So I have been managing the full work since then. Before that, it was the 2 of us." He did the heavy work and I did the rest, which meant I did most of it. She paused. He was not a well man even before November. The Kansas winters were hard on him. Where were you from before? Ohio, she said. We came out in 1873 when the act was still drawing people west. My father believed in the promise of it, 160 acres for nothing but the work of your hands. She watched the road ahead. He was right to believe in it. The land is good. It is better than anything we had in Ohio. What will you do with it? He asked. It was not an intrusive question. It was asked with genuine interest, the way a person who understands land asks about someone else's. I have winter wheat in now that will be ready to cut in June, she said. I want to add a dairy cow in the fall if I can afford one. The creek that runs along the north boundary is reliable, which means I can irrigate the lower field if I put in the work this summer. In 5 years, I want the house rebuilt properly, stone foundation, instead of the sod addition my father put up in the first year. She heard herself talking and realized she had not laid all of this out in words in a very long time because there had been no one to say it to. I am sorry. That is a great deal of detail you did not ask for. I asked what you would do with it, he said. That is what I was asking. I wanted the detail. She looked at him. He was watching the road ahead, one hand easy on the reins, his hat brim throwing a shadow across his eyes, and there was nothing in his posture that suggested politeness. He had simply meant what he said. What about you? She asked. You said cattle. Beef cattle, mostly Herefords, he said. My father started the Ramsey spread in 1869. He came from Missouri. I took it over when he retired back east 3 years ago. We run about 200 head now, with plans to expand if we can secure the grazing rights on the federal land to the northeast. Is that the water rights dispute you mentioned? It was, he said. We settled it last year. Took 2 years and cost me more in legal fees than I care to think about, which is how I ended up knowing Warren Aldous. It is convenient that you did, she said. He glanced at her. It was convenient for me too today. Gave me a reason to introduce myself. There was something in the way he said it that made her aware, suddenly and unexpectedly, of the width of the wagon seat between them and the way the afternoon light fell across the side of his face, and she looked back at the road ahead and told herself firmly to pay attention to the ruts. You could have introduced yourself at any time, she said. We are neighbors. I could have, he agreed. But I am not naturally a man who finds reasons to call on people without one. I needed a proper reason. And a woman being laughed out of a government office provided that. It was a compelling reason, he said, and this time there was no mistaking it. It was a smile, real and warm and directed at her, and it changed his face entirely, opened it up like a door that had been shut against weather. She did not look away fast enough to miss it, and she felt something shift in her chest that she filed away to examine later when she was alone. They reached the junction of the eastern road where their properties diverged, and Dexter pulled his wagon to a stop. Your turn-off is here, he said. You will be home before dark if you push Chester. Chester does not push easily, she said, gathering her reins, but I will manage. She started to click Chester forward, then stopped. Mr. Ramsey, she said. He waited. Thank you, she said, not just for Aldous, for listening through the window. He looked at her steadily. Any decent person would have done the same. A decent person would have, she agreed. You were the only one standing outside. She drove Chester east toward home, and she did not look back, but she thought she could hear his wagon sitting still on the road behind her for a long moment before it started moving north. The petition was filed on Friday. Gertrude knew because Aldous sent word through the mail rider who came out her way every other week, a short note written in his precise hand confirming that the documents had been submitted and that he expected a response from the land office within 10 days. 10 days passed, then 12, then 15. On the 16th day, she was on her knees in the south field working out the new fencing line, driving stakes with a mallet in the hard ground and sweating through her work shirt, when she heard a horse coming up the road from the east. She sat back on her heels and looked. and it was not the male rider. It was Dexter Ramsey, riding a bay horse with the easy, unhurried seat of a man who is comfortable on horseback the way other men are comfortable in armchairs. She stood up and pulled off her work gloves as he came through the gate and stopped. "I was in town this morning," he said by way of explanation, though she had not asked. "Aldous asked me to bring this out." He held down an envelope. She took it and opened it. It was a letter from the Callen County Land Office. She read it twice, and then a third time slowly to make sure she was reading it correctly. Harmon Briggs, under the weight of Warren Aldis's formal petition, and what the letter described as a review of applicable federal statutes, had approved the transfer of the homestead claim to her name. She was now, on paper, the rightful head of the claim on Section 14 of the eastern parcel. The final patent would be issued upon confirmation that the 5-year residency and improvement requirements had been met, for which she was invited to submit her documentation at her earliest convenience. She read it a fourth time. Then she folded it very carefully along its original creases and put it in the pocket of her work skirt, and she looked up at Dexter on his bay horse in the middle of her field, and she said, "He approved it." "I know," Dexter said. "Aldous showed me the copy he kept." "He approved it," she said again, and her voice did something on the second saying that she had not intended it to do, went soft at the edges in a way that she recognized as the precursor to tears and fiercely did not want. Dexter dismounted. He tied his horse to the fence post she had just planted and walked toward her with his hands in his pockets, and he stopped a few feet away and looked at her with that same steady, clear-eyed attention he had offered from the beginning. "You did that," he said. "You walked in there and made the right argument, and you came back with documentation and a lawyer, and you did that." "He still laughed at me," she said, and she hated that it still sat in her chest like a stone. "He did," Dexter said, without softening it or explaining it away. "And now he has approved your claim and you have the letter in your pocket. Both things are true." She pressed her lips together and looked out at the field, at the stakes she had been driving all morning, the work that would become the fence that would mark the boundary of land that was now officially hers. "I'm going to need a witness for the final patent submission," she said, because saying practical things was easier than saying what she actually felt. "Someone who can attest to the 5-year continuous improvement." Mr. Aldous said a neighbor would carry weight. "I will do it," Dexter said immediately. She looked back at him. "You have only just met me. I have seen your south field from my north fence line for 3 years, he said. "I saw the winter wheat go in last fall. I saw the well casing replaced in autumn of 1876. I can attest to continuous improvement." He paused. "And I have met you now. That counts for something too." She thought about what it meant that he had been watching her field for 3 years and she had never known it, had never looked north across the fence line and wondered who the neighbor was, had been so absorbed in the work and the loneliness that the person on the other side of the boundary had never registered as a presence she might need. "Why did you never come over?" she asked. He took a moment with it. "Same reason I said before. I needed a reason, and your father was a private man. He didn't come calling on me either, and I respected that." "He was private," she agreed. "But you—" He stopped. "But I—" she prompted. He looked at the ground for a moment, then back at her, and she had the sense of someone deciding something. "You were out here working every day," he said, "and I saw you, and I thought about whether I should come over, and I didn't, and I'm not entirely proud of that." The honesty of it hit her somewhere unexpected. "Well," she said after a moment, "you came when it mattered." "I heard you through a window," he said, and the self-deprecation in it made her laugh, actually laugh for the first time in months, a real one that she had not manufactured for anyone's benefit. He looked startled by the sound of it, and then something in his face went very warm and still, and he looked at her as if the laugh had told him something he had been trying to figure out. "Would you stay for coffee?" she asked. "I cannot offer much. I have biscuits from this morning and a fair amount of gratitude." "Coffee sounds good," he said. So they went to the house, she in her work shirt and boots with mud on her knees, he tying his bay horse to the porch post with the comfortable ease of someone who has done this exact thing 1,000 times in different places, and she made coffee on the wood stove while he sat at the kitchen table with his hat in his lap and looked at the room around him the way a person looks at a room they are trying to understand. "You built this shelf?" he asked, nodding at the set of wooden shelves she had installed along the east wall in the fall. "I did. It's good work. I watched my father do enough carpentry to learn the basics," she said, pouring coffee into 2 tin cups. "He was not a builder by trade, but he was careful about things. He measured twice." "Good habit," Dexter said. She brought the cups to the table and sat across from him, and they drank coffee together in the mid-morning quiet of a house that had been too quiet for too long, and the conversation moved between practical things, soil types and fence costs, and the particular way the creek ran in high spring, and then gradually into less practical things, into Ohio and Missouri and what they had each wanted when they were young and what they wanted now. He had wanted, he said, to stay west. Had never wanted to go back east with his father. Had taken the Ramsey land with both hands and intended to build it into something that would outlast him. She had wanted, she said, to be useful in a place that was real. Ohio had felt finished to her, everything already decided, the roads already worn into their grooves. Kansas still had room in it for something to be made from nothing. "That's exactly it," he said, leaning forward slightly, and his eyes were lit with recognition, the particular warmth of hearing someone else say the thing you have thought 100 times but never said aloud. They talked until the coffee was cold, and the sun had moved across the window, and Chester brayed from the paddock to indicate that he had an opinion about his midday meal. Dexter stood and put on his hat and said he had fencing to check on the north side, which was true, and that he was glad the letter had brought good news, which was obviously true, and that he would come back to sign the documentation for the land office whenever she needed it, which he said in the manner of someone announcing an intention that extends considerably beyond the stated purpose. She walked him to his horse. "Mr. Ramsey," she said. He had his foot in the stirrup. He looked back at her over his shoulder. "If you happen to be riding this way on a Sunday," she said, "I usually have a better state of coffee available, and actual food, not just biscuits." He settled into the saddle and looked down at her, and the smile was back, full and unguarded. "I happen to ride this way on Sundays," he said, "as it turns out." He touched the brim of his hat and rode north, and Gertrude watched him until he reached the fence line and turned toward the gate, and then she went to feed Chester and stood in the paddock with her hand on the mule's nose and thought about the morning and the letter in her pocket, and the way a day could begin in humiliation and end in something that felt, cautiously and unexpectedly, like the beginning of a different story. He came that Sunday. He brought a jar of preserves from his housekeeper, Mrs. Ellen Holt, a stout, practical woman in her 60s who kept the Ramsey house in order and who had apparently heard about Gertrude's situation, and sent the preserves as a statement of solidarity expressed in fruit. He came the Sunday after that too, and the one after that, and what had begun as a tenuous practical arrangement of neighborliness became, with the steady accumulation of Sundays, something that Gertrude could not pretend was only neighborliness without being dishonest with herself. He helped her replace 2 posts in the south fence that had rotted at the base over the winter. She helped him sort through a surveyor's report on the northeast grazing land that had arrived with a notation she found questionable and proved, upon careful reading, to be an error in his favor that the surveyor's office had made, which she caught and which he said saved him the embarrassment of claiming something he had not earned. "You read carefully," he said. "My father thought reading carefully was the most important skill a person could have," she said. "More than arithmetic even." "He was right," Dexter said. "He was right about most things," she said quietly, "just not about his own health." There was a pause, and then Dexter said, "What was he like?" So she told him. She told him about Thomas Reed, who had been a school teacher in Ohio and a reader of almanacs, and a man who had named his mule Chester after a president he admired, who had planted a rose bush on the first spring they were in Kansas because he said a homestead without something beautiful was not a home, just a claim. She told him about how her father had made her read every word of the Homestead Act aloud before they signed anything, so that she would know exactly what she was signing and why, which was why she had been able to walk into Harmon Briggs's office and make the argument she made. Dexter listened the way he did everything, with complete and patient attention. "The rose bush," he said. "Is it still there?" "It is," she said. "It will bloom in May." He came back in May to see it bloom. He also came back because by May the Sunday visits had become something that both of them were aware of in the way you are aware of a change in weather before the sky shows it, a particular atmospheric shift that has no name yet but is unmistakably a change. He would arrive in the late morning, and they would have coffee, and then they would walk out to whatever needed doing or examining on the land, because neither of them was the kind of person who could sit still in a kitchen for very long when there was work to be understood. They would walk the fence lines and discuss the crops and argue, with mutual enjoyment, about the best method for draining the low corner of the south field, which sat wet after heavy rain in a way that threatened the roots. He thought drainage tiles laid at an angle down to the creek were the answer. She thought a raised bed approach would be more economical. They went back and forth on it for 3 Sundays before she conceded that the tiles were probably right, and he conceded that she had found a way to source them at a price that made the project actually viable. And when they reached this agreement, they were standing in the low corner of the south field in early May with mud on their boots and the rose bush blooming in small yellow clusters near the porch rail. And he looked at her, and she looked at him, and neither of them said anything for a moment. Then he said, "Gertrude." It was the first time he had used her first name. They had been moving toward it for weeks, through the formal address of Miss Reed and the gradual informality of long conversations and shared work, but hearing it in his voice did something particular to her, made the name feel different than it had in her own mouth her whole life. "Yes," she said. He looked at the mud on his boots. Then he looked back at her with an expression she recognized now as the one he wore when he was deciding something. "I am going to say something," he said, "and I would like you to hear it completely before you respond to it." "All right," she said. "I have been coming here every Sunday for 3 months," he said. "And I have thought for most of those months that I should say something rather than continue arriving with the excuse of fence posts and survey reports. But I am better at work than at saying things which I suspect you have noticed." "I have noticed," she said. He looked at her steadily. "I would like to keep coming here," he said. "And I would like to be honest about why, not because of the fence or the survey or because I am a good neighbor, because I like talking to you more than I like talking to anyone. Because you are the most capable and the most honest person I have met in a long time, and I am more interested in everything when you are part of it. And because when I am riding back north on Sunday evenings, I am already thinking about the following Sunday." The field was very quiet. A meadowlark was singing somewhere in the grass, and the rose bush was blooming 8 yards away, and the afternoon sky was the deep, clear blue that only happens in May in Kansas when the air is still warm enough to be gentle. Gertrude Reed, who had been surviving on her own for the better part of a year on stubbornness and practicality, and a deep, unexamined loneliness that she had simply decided not to look at, because looking at it would not help, looked at this man who had heard her through a single-pane window on a terrible Tuesday morning, and had said, "Come with me," with the uncomplicated conviction of someone who meant it. And she thought that perhaps she was allowed to stop surviving for a moment and simply say what was true. "I think about the following Sunday, too," she said. "Most weeks I think about it by Monday." The expression that crossed his face was not the smile she had grown familiar with. It was something older and deeper than a smile, something that lived below the surface of an expression in the eyes. He reached out slowly and deliberately and took her hand. She let him. His hand was large and warm and calloused in the specific pattern of rain work, and he held her hand as if it were something worth holding carefully. "May I come courting?" he asked. "Properly, so you know what my intentions are." "I know what your intentions are," she said. "I have known for approximately 6 weeks." And yes, she said, you may come courting. He kept hold of her hand. Properly, she added, because she was who she was and some things needed stating even when they were obvious. And he looked at her with that warm, still expression and said, of course, as if the word had no other meaning than that. Summer came to the Kansas plains in the particular golden, relentless way it had, heat building from June into July, until the air shimmered over the distant grass, and the creek ran lower, and Chester retreated to the shade of the cottonwood tree by mid-afternoon, with a philosophical resignation that Gertrude privately envied. The wheat came in, and it was a good harvest, better than her father's last one had been, because she had caught a rust problem in the lower rows in May and treated it before it spread. Dexter brought 2 of his ranch hands over for the cutting days, and she fed them lunch and dinner both days, and they cut and bundled the wheat in the hot, efficient way of men who know the work, and she worked alongside them every moment. And Dexter's hand Clem, a weathered Mexican vaquero of about 40 with a wide smile, and no opinion he was unwilling to share, told Dexter in the plainly audible way of someone who either cannot hear very well or does not care whether he can be overheard, that Miss Reed worked harder than the man whose land it was, and Dexter should not let her get away. Dexter, stacking bundles 10 feet away, said he was working on it. Gertrude, stacking bundles on the other side, said she could hear both of them perfectly well. Clem grinned enormously and said in that case they were welcome. The final patent came through in late July. Aldous sent it out on the mail rider himself rather than leaving it to chance. It was a formal document on heavy paper with the federal seal, and her name printed in the clear, bureaucratic hand of a government clerk who had no idea what it meant to the person receiving it. Gertrude Reed. Section 14, Eastern Parcel, Callen County, Kansas, hers. She sat on the porch steps with the patent in her hands and read her own name on it until the words went soft from looking, and Chester came and put his long nose on her shoulder and breathed hay breath at her in the comforting, oblivious way that mules have. And she said, "Papa, I got it," to the warm July air and the wheat stubble in the south field, and the rose bush that had finished its bloom, and was just showing the green of new leaves coming in for the rest of the summer. She told Dexter that evening when he rode over, ostensibly to return a fence tool he had borrowed, but actually because it was a Tuesday and he had stopped pretending he needed an excuse. He read the patent himself, holding it with the careful respect of someone who understands what land means. Then he folded it exactly along its creases and handed it back to her. "Your father would have been proud," he said. "I know," she said. "He would have said something dry and understated about it and then been insufferably pleased for the rest of the week." Dexter smiled. "Sounds like a good man." "The best," she said simply. They were sitting on the porch by this point, the sun going red and enormous in the west, the kind of sunset that Kansas produces in high summer as if it has something to prove. She had brought out 2 cups of lemonade, a small luxury from the sugar she had allowed herself after the wheat money came in, and they were sitting in the 2 chairs she had set on the porch in the spring, close enough that their voices did not need to carry. "Gertrude," he said. "Yes," she said, because she had learned by now that when he said her name in that particular tone something real was coming, and it deserved a clear field. He was looking out at the sunset. "I have been thinking about something for a while," he said, "and I want to say it now while I have the nerve." "You have nerve enough," she said. "You have demonstrated it repeatedly." "Not always with the things that matter most," he said. She waited. He turned in his chair to look at her directly, and in the red evening light his eyes were very dark and very serious, and she thought she had never in her life felt so clearly seen by another person. "I would like to marry you," he said, "if you will have me." The prairie was very still and very wide, and the light was doing extraordinary things to the undersides of the clouds on the western horizon. And Gertrude thought about the morning in the land office, and the laughter, and the walk to Warren Aldis's office, and 37 Sunday mornings, and a jar of preserves from a woman she had not yet met, and a man who had held her hand in a muddy south field, and asked to court her with a formality that was somehow more touching than anything she could have invented. "Dexter," she said. "Yes," he said, in the same way she said it because they had learned that about each other. "I will have you," she said. He reached across the space between the chairs and took her hand again, and this time she turned her hand over and held his properly, and they sat on the porch of the land that was hers and watched the Kansas sunset burn down to amber, and then to the deep blue of a summer evening, and the meadowlarks called in the grass, and Chester made a sound of deep contentment from his paddock, and she thought that this was what her father had been looking for when he brought them west. This particular feeling of being exactly where you were meant to be. They were married in October at the Harlow Methodist Church, on a Saturday with the cottonwood trees in their full yellow gold, and the air sharp with the first real cold of the season. Mrs. Ellen Holt, who turned out to be a warm and forthright woman who had taken an immediate liking to Gertrude and described her, within 10 minutes of their meeting, as exactly the sort of woman the Ramsey place had been needing, made the wedding cake herself and cried during the ceremony, which she explained afterward was not sentiment but onion exposure, which no one believed. Warren Aldous attended and brought a bottle of good whiskey. Clem attended and brought his wife, a beautiful, sharp-tongued woman named Dolers, who looked Gertrude over with assessing eyes and then embraced her warmly, and told her that Dexter had been difficult to live near this whole summer because he was happy and did not know what to do with it, which Clem immediately denied and then confirmed. Harmon Briggs was not in attendance. He had, in fact, left his position at the land office 3 months prior, following a federal inquiry into his handling of several other homestead claims in the county, an inquiry that had been prompted, Aldous told them with barely concealed satisfaction, by the documentation trail that Gertrude's case had left behind. She was not entirely without sympathy for the man, but she was not with very much of it either. They were married by the Reverend Charles Finch, who was a small, earnest man with genuine warmth, and Dexter said his vows in the steady, unhurried voice of someone who means what he says, and Gertrude said hers in the clear, precise way she did everything that mattered, and they walked out of the church into the cold October air as husband and wife, and Clem threw grain rather than rice because this was a practical part of the world and grain made more sense, and Chester, who had been tied at the post outside the church because Gertrude had insisted, and Dexter had agreed without argument because she was right that Chester was family, brayed enormously at the sound of everyone laughing. The question of where to live had been discussed at length and resolved with the shared practicality that characterized how they approached most things. The Ramsey house was larger and in better repair, built of stone and wood in 1869 and added to twice since, with 4 proper rooms and a kitchen that Mrs. Holt had organized with military efficiency. Gertrude's house on Section 14, the sodden frame structure her father had built and she had worked to improve, would be maintained as a working building, used during planting and harvest seasons when it made more sense to sleep closer to her land, and she would keep her cattle on her property and her crop rotations going with the help of Dexter's hands. The land was hers. That was not a question. The patent was in her name and would stay in her name, and Dexter had made this clear to her without her having to raise it, had said simply, "Your land is yours," on the day she had agreed to marry him, with the straightforward certainty of someone who has given the matter real thought and arrived at the only conclusion that makes sense. She had loved him before that. After it, she loved him in a way that had no convenient name, that was rooted and serious and absolutely certain. Their first winter together was one of the hard Kansas ones, with snow in November that came before people were ready for it and stayed longer than it was welcome, and temperatures in January that drove the cattle into the sheltered south draw and froze the water in the indoor barrel overnight. They worked through it together, she and Dexter and Clem and the other hand, a young man from Indiana named Samuel who was 19 and eager, and made up for his inexperience with an agreeableness that kept the mood manageable through the difficult days. There were mornings when she and Dexter worked side by side in the barn or on the frozen ground before the sun was properly up, breath clouding in the cold air, too tired to talk, and she thought that this was what it really was, not the porch sunsets and the Sunday coffee, but the shared work in the cold and the silent, solid knowledge that the other person was there. She thought her father would have approved of him. Not effusively. Thomas Reed was not an effusive man, but in the measured, meaningful way he had approved of things that had proven themselves worthy of approval. By February she knew she was pregnant, and she told Dexter on a Sunday morning when the snow had gone thin on the south-facing slopes and there was, for the first time in months, a quality to the light that suggested spring was a real intention and not just a rumor. He went completely still for a moment when she told him. Then he reached across the table and took her face in his hands very gently, the way a person handles something precious, and he looked at her with an expression so full and so unguarded that she felt it like a physical warmth spreading across her chest. "Gertrude," he said. "I know," she said, because she did. He kissed her forehead, then her mouth. Then he sat back and looked at the ceiling for a moment in the way people do when they are processing something enormous, and then he looked back at her and said, "We should tell Mrs. Holt." "We should absolutely tell Mrs. Holt," she agreed. Mrs. Holt, when told, stopped kneading bread dough, turned around, and embraced Gertrude with flowery arms in a way that left white handprints on the back of her dark wool dress, and then held her at arm's length and looked at her with eyes that were full, and said, "It's about time this house had some life in it," and then went back to her bread with the efficiently contained emotion of a woman who has decided where her feelings are permitted and where they are not. The boy was born in late September of 1879, which was an excellent time for it because the harvest was in, and Dexter was not needed in the fields and could be present in the house for the 3 days of difficult labor that preceded the arrival. He stayed near the whole time, which was not the custom and which Gertrude did not ask him to do but which he chose without being asked, and Mrs. Holt, who had been a midwife in her earlier years in addition to everything else, managed the birth with calm authority and told Dexter at regular intervals to either be useful or be quiet, and he was both. The boy was born at dawn on a clear, cool September morning, with the light coming through the east window in long gold bars, and he announced himself with considerable confidence, which Mrs. Holt said was a very good sign, and Dexter sat on the edge of the bed and held his son for the first time with the expression of a man who has just understood something about the world that he could not have understood any other way. They named him Thomas, for her father. Thomas Reed Ramsey, born September 22, 1879, Callen County, Kansas. Gertrude held him and looked at his face, which was the face of a person who has arrived and intends to be reckoned with, and she thought about the rose bush her father had planted, and the patent on the wall of the house on Section 14, and the particular morning in the spring of 1878, when she had driven through mud 12 miles to a land office, and been laughed at by men who did not understand her and had walked out into the sunlight and found, leaning against a fence post, a man with dark eyes and 4 days of beard and the most useful offer she had ever received. "Come with me." She had not known, standing on that sidewalk, that it would mean all of this. That it would mean patent paper and muddy south fields and drainage tiles and Sunday coffee and wheat harvests and October weddings, and this particular morning with this particular small, loud, brand new person in her arms. She supposed that was the nature of following the right person. You did not know where you were going until you were already there. Thomas grew with a determination that gratified everyone and exhausted most of them. He was walking before he was a year old, which Dolers, who visited regularly with Clem and had become one of Gertrude's closest friends, said was either a great blessing or a catastrophe depending on how much you valued keeping things in their intended places. He was talking in full sentences by the time he was 2, and the sentences were frequently about cattle, which he had decided were the most important things in the world, a preference that made Dexter so pleased he could barely contain it. The land on Section 14 continued to produce. Gertrude rode out to it 3 times a week through the spring and summer, often with Thomas balanced in front of her on the saddle, which he loved with a ferocity that made Chester, who he had also decided were the most important things in the world, seem like a secondary affection. She had hired a local farmer's son, a steady young man named George Kepler, to help with the heavy field work during planting and harvest, and the dairy cow she had planned for had become 2 dairy cows by 1881, and the stone foundation she had planned for the farmhouse went in that same year, rebuilt with a proper floor and 2 glass windows that caught the afternoon light. She and Dexter rode out together to look at the finished house in November of 1881, a cold, clear day with their breath-making clouds and Thomas bundled between them on the wagon seat making urgent comments about everything he saw. "It's a good house," Dexter said. "It is," she agreed. "Your father would have approved." "He measured twice," she said, and Dexter smiled. She had also, in the 2 years since Thomas was born, spent a significant portion of her energy on something she had decided was as important as the land itself. There were 4 other women in Callen County who had attempted to file homestead claims independently and had been denied or discouraged by Harmon Briggs or by his successor, a man named Pollard who was more polite than Briggs but no less obstructive when he thought he could get away with it. Gertrude had found each of these women through Mrs. Holt's considerable knowledge of local affairs, and had brought each of them to Warren Aldis's office on Clement Street, and had sat with them while they made their cases. 3 of the 4 had eventually received their patents. The 4th, a widow named Clara Sotheby, had a more complicated situation involving an incomplete filing by her late husband, but Aldis was still working on it, and Gertrude visited Clara regularly and brought her vegetables from the Section 14 garden and refused to let the matter drop. Dexter knew about all of this. He had never asked her to stop, or suggested she was overextending herself, or implied that it was not her business. He had, on 2 occasions, driven her to Aldis's office himself when the weather was too uncertain for her to go alone, and on 1 occasion had also lent Clara Sotheby a horse for 3 weeks when hers went lame during a critical period, because he said it was the right thing to do and he was in the habit of doing the right thing. She had not required him to do any of it. He had done it because it mattered to her, and what mattered to her mattered to him. The simplicity and the depth of that symmetry continued to strike her, on ordinary days, as something worth noticing. The spring of 1882 brought a complication that was not the weather and not a fence dispute, but a man named Aldis Mercer who had been purchasing land aggressively in the eastern county for 18 months, and who had, without any announcement, purchased the claim directly south of Section 14 that had been abandoned 2 years prior, and which Gertrude had been hoping to petition to add to her own holding. She heard about this from Samuel, who had stayed on at the Ramsey Ranch and was now 22 and considerably less inexperienced than he had been, and who heard about it in town. Mercer was a land speculator from St. Louis with money and connections, and a lawyer of his own who was nothing like Warren Aldis in terms of principle, and everything like him in terms of technical competence. His plan, insofar as Gertrude could determine it from the talk in town, was to consolidate several parcels of eastern county land and sell them as a block to a railroad interest that was looking at a southern route through Kansas. The problem this created for Gertrude was specific and serious. The south parcel, if it went to railroad land, would put the tracks within a quarter mile of her southern boundary, which would make her lower fields essentially impossible to work due to the noise and the smoke and the fence disruptions that railroad construction inevitably produced, and would also compromise the value and the quiet of her land permanently. She told Dexter about it on a Sunday evening when Thomas was finally asleep, and the house was quiet, and the lamp was burning low on the kitchen table. He listened the whole way through, Then he said, "What do you want to do?" "I want to buy the south parcel," she said, "before Mercer can sell it to the railroad." "What is it going to cost?" She had already done the arithmetic. She laid it out for him, the figures she had gotten from Aldous on the approximate current value of the abandoned claim, the state of her savings from the wheat and dairy money, the gap that remained. "I have about 2/3 of it," she said. "I can cover the rest," he said. "Dexter, it protects your land," he said. "And yours is next to mine, so it protects mine. And it is a good piece of ground, that south parcel. It has good grass. I do not want to go into debt to you," she said. "It is not debt," he said. "We are married. My money is yours and yours is mine. That is the legal reality and also my genuine preference." He leaned forward. "I understand that you value your independence and your name on your own title, and I would not have it any other way. But that does not mean I cannot help you buy land that will benefit both of us." She looked at him across the table in the low lamplight. This man she had been married to for 3.5 years, this man who had never once in that time made her feel that she needed to ask permission for her own decisions or apologize for her own opinions or diminish herself to fit the size of his idea of what she should be. "I know," she said. "I know you are right." "I usually am," he said, and she threw a dishcloth at him, which he caught, and they were laughing, and that was how they made the decision. They bought the south parcel in April of 1882, through Aldous, outright and fast before Mercer could finalize any other arrangements. Mercer expressed his displeasure through his lawyer in a letter that was technically civil and practically threatening. Aldous wrote back in a manner that was technically civil and comprehensively devastating, and the matter was resolved. Gertrude added the south parcel to her Section 14 holding, and spent the following summer working with Dexter and Clem to fence it properly and assess its grazing capacity. And she found that it had, in addition to good grass, a reliable spring-fed pond that she had not known about, which added considerably to its value, and which Thomas, who was now almost 3, treated as a personal discovery of supreme importance. Clara Sotheby's claim was finally resolved in the fall of 1882, a full 2 years after they had first brought it to Aldous. The incomplete filing had required correspondence with the Federal Land Commissioner's office in Topeka, and then a supplementary affidavit from a neighbor who had witnessed her husband's original improvements. But in the end, the patent was issued, and Clara Sotheby held it in her kitchen with shaking hands, and wept in a way that did not require any explanation. Gertrude, sitting across the table from her, thought about her own name on her own patent and her father's voice in her memory saying, "Read every word before you sign anything." And she thought that justice, when it came, was worth every month of fighting it took to get there. She rode home that evening in the early November cold, the last light gone orange on the western edge of the prairie, and she was tired in every bone but in the particular way that good tiredness feels, the way that belongs to days when the work was real, and the result was real, and both of them were yours. Dexter was on the porch when she came through the gate, waiting with the lamp lit against the dark. Thomas was presumably in bed, and the house was warm with the light from the kitchen windows, and he came down the steps and took her horse's reins and looked up at her. "Clara got her patent," she said. His face opened. "Tell me." She dismounted and he led the horse, and she told him the whole story as they walked to the barn, the affidavit and the Topeka correspondence and the shaking hands and the tears, and he listened the whole way through the way he always did, completely and with the kind of attention that tells a person they are worth listening to. In the barn, while he was unsaddling the horse, he said, "You did that for her. Aldous did most of it." "Gertrude," he said, in the particular way he said her name when he intended for her to stop being modest. "All right," she said, "I did some of it." He hung the saddle and turned around and crossed the barn and took her face in his hands and kissed her, slow and real, the way he kissed her when he meant it most. And then he held her against him in the cold barn with the horses breathing soft and warm around them and said against her hair, "I am proud of you every single day." She closed her eyes and held onto the front of his coat and let herself be held, which was something she had been learning to do without apology for the past 4 years, letting the one person she trusted all the way to the bottom hold her when holding was what was needed. By the spring of 1883, she was pregnant again, and told him earlier this time because they had learned with Thomas that the knowing was easier than the not knowing, and he received the news the same way he received all news from her, with complete attention and the very particular warmth he seemed to reserve for the moments that mattered most. This time it was a daughter, born in November of 1883 on a day when the first light snow of the season was coming down outside the bedroom window in soft, slow flakes, and Thomas, who was 4 and had been told to stay in the kitchen with Mrs. Holt, had apparently not stayed in the kitchen with Mrs. Holt and was found on the stairs by Dexter, sitting very quietly with his arms around his knees, listening. When he was brought in to meet his sister, he looked at her for a long moment with the serious, assessing expression he got from both his parents in different measures, and then he said, "She is very small," with a gravity that made Mrs. Holt press her lips together against a smile. "She will get bigger," Dexter told him. Thomas considered this. "All right," he said, in the tone of someone granting reasonable approval. They named her June, for the month her parents had first walked the wheat fields together, which was a private reason they did not explain to anyone who asked why June, because it belonged to them. June Thomas Reed Ramsey had her grandfather's determined quality and her mother's capacity for precise, focused attention and her father's patience, and from her very first months, she seemed to regard the world as something to be examined thoroughly before coming to any conclusions. Thomas, 4 years old and suddenly a person with a very important role, took his responsibility with great seriousness, and could be found sitting next to her cradle narrating the events of his day to her in extensive detail, because he had decided she needed to be educated on how things worked, and Gertrude would stand in the doorway of the nursery and watch him and feel something so large and so warm in her chest that she had no word for it and did not need one. Warren Aldous visited in the spring of 1884 to deliver some updated documentation on the Section 14 patent extension and stayed for dinner. And at the table, with Thomas talking earnestly about the Hereford cattle and June sitting in Gertrude's lap, and the kitchen warm with the smell of the meal Mrs. Holt had made and left before going to her own house on the property edge, Aldous looked around the table and said, "You know, when you came into my office 6 years ago, I thought here is a woman who will make something happen. I did not know it would be all of this." "I didn't either," Gertrude said honestly. "I did," Dexter said, and she looked at him and he was looking at her with that same expression he had in the barn the November before, the proud and certain and deeply private one that she felt like a hand on her heart. "You did not," she said. "I had a reasonable expectation," he said. And Thomas asked what a reasonable expectation was, and Dexter explained it, and the conversation moved on, but she kept the moment in her hand like something she intended to carry. The following summer, Clem and Dollars celebrated their 20th wedding anniversary, and Dexter and Gertrude gave them a dinner that began as a modest affair and became, through the natural expansion of gatherings in that part of the world, a full evening with neighbors and friends and Samuel's fiddle, which he played passably well and with enormous enthusiasm, and the big yard of the Ramsey house strung with lanterns that Ellen Holt had accumulated over years of careful storage. They danced on the packed earth of the yard, and Gertrude danced with Dexter in the warm summer dark under the lantern light, and she was 32 years old and the most herself she had ever been, and the man she was dancing with had his hand warm and sure at her back, and was looking at her the way he had been looking at her since a Tuesday morning in 1878, when she walked out of a land office with her chin up and her heart torn, and found him leaning against a fence post. "What are you thinking about?" he asked quietly, because he knew her face well enough to know she was somewhere particular in her thoughts. "The land office," she said. "Harmon Briggs," he said with a dry, fond recognition. "The laughter," she said, "and then you." He pulled her slightly closer. And now? She thought about the patent on the wall and the rose bush and the south parcel and Clara Sotheby's shaking hands and Thomas on the stairs and June in her cradle and 6 years of Sundays, and the feeling she had described to herself, that first evening, as cautious and unexpected, which had grown into something that was neither cautious nor surprising, but was simply the ground she stood on, as real and as certain as the Kansas earth. "Now I think the Tuesday was worth it," she said. He rested his chin briefly against her temple. "You were going to be fine regardless," he said. "You had everything you needed already." "I know," she said, "but this is better." They swayed in the lantern light while Samuel's fiddle played on and Thomas ran circles around the yard with Clem and Dolar's grandchildren, and June slept in her basket on the porch in the warm evening air, and the prairie spread wide and dark and open in every direction around the house and the yard and the people gathered in it. By 1886, the Ramsey operation had grown considerably. They ran just over 300 head of cattle on the combined grazing land, which included the northeast federal parcel Dexter had secured and the south parcel that Gertrude had added to her holding. The wheat on Section 14 was producing reliably, and the dairy operation had expanded to 5 cows managed by George Kepler, who had proven himself so capable that Gertrude had put him on a proper wage and given him the use of the small house on the west edge of the property. And he had brought his young wife out from Wichita, and the property that had once been one woman's lonely claim was now a working community with its own rhythms and seasons and dependencies. Thomas was 7, in the local school that had been established in 1880, and was already asking questions that his teacher found either impressive or exhausting depending on the subject and the day. June was 3, and had developed a vocabulary and a personality that her father described as formidable, and her mother described as familiar. Gertrude rode out to Section 14 one September morning alone, leaving the children with Mrs. Holt and Dexter managing a fence situation on the North Range, and she walked the land in the warm, early autumn light, walked all of it from boundary to boundary, the south parcel and the original claim, the creek and the spring-fed pond, the rebuilt farmhouse and the fenced fields, and the corner of the north field where her dog was buried, and the rose bush that had gotten old and woody, but still bloomed every May in small, determined yellow clusters. She stood at the center of it and turned slowly, taking in all 4 directions, and she thought about her father bringing her west with the almanac and the act, and the conviction that a person could make something from nothing if they were willing to do the work. And she thought that he had been right, more right than he had known to be, because what she had made was not just the land but the life on the land and the person she had become while making it. She thought about Harmon Briggs and his laughter and his spectacles and his inadequate interpretation of federal law, and she felt something that was not quite forgiveness and not quite contempt but somewhere between them, something like understanding without agreement, the knowledge that small people exist and do small harm and the harm can be overcome. She thought about Dexter leaning on the fence post saying, "Come with me," 2 words and a willingness, and how she had followed not because she was desperate but because she recognized something in him that was real and had been right to recognize it. She turned once more slowly, and then she walked back to the farmhouse and sat on the porch steps in the September warmth, and after a while she heard hoofbeats on the road from the north, and she looked up, and it was Dexter, riding the bay horse that was getting older now but still moved well, coming through the gate with Thomas up behind him, the boy's arms around his father's waist and his face bright with the specific joy of a child on a horse he loves. Dexter saw her on the steps and raised his hand, and she raised hers, and he rode up and dismounted and helped Thomas down, and Thomas came running across the yard toward her with something in his fist that turned out to be a particularly good rock he had found near the north fence. "Look at this one, Mama," he said, pushing it at her. She took the rock and examined it with the seriousness it deserved. "This is a very fine rock," she said. "I thought so," Thomas said, satisfied, and then went to investigate something near the rose bush. Dexter sat down on the steps beside her. "Fence is sorted," he said. "Good," she said. He looked at her for a moment. "You all right?" "More than all right," she said. He looked out at the land, the same long look he had been giving it for years, the attentive, respectful look of someone who understands land. "It's a good place," he said. "It is the best place," she said. He put his arm around her and she leaned against his shoulder in the warm September morning, and Thomas was crouching by the rose bush describing the properties of his rock to the plant in a serious undertone, and June was at the Ramsey house with Mrs. Holt probably reorganizing something that did not need reorganizing, and the patent was on the farmhouse wall with her name on it, and the land stretched in every direction, hers and his and theirs, real and permanent and earned. The autumn of 1887 brought the first real hard test to what they had built, not a crisis of land or law, but of weather, a season that started hard and got harder, a winter that the old-timers in Harlow said was the worst since 1872. The cattle suffered despite every precaution, and they lost 11 head between December and February, which was painful in the specific, financial way, and also in the way that the loss of any living thing under your care is painful when you are the kind of person who takes your responsibilities seriously. But they did not lose the herd. They worked through it, she and Dexter and Clem and Samuel and George Kepler, taking shifts through the worst nights to keep the cattle moving in the draw and the water from freezing solid. And when the spring came in March with that particular quality of relief that only very hard winters can produce, the land was still there, and the herd was reduced but intact, and the fields were ready for planting. She had not known before Dexter what it was to go through a hard winter with someone who was not trying to endure it, but trying to solve it alongside you, not waiting for it to be over but meeting it straight on with the same energy he brought to everything. She had not known a great many things before Dexter, but she had learned most of them by now. June turned 5 in November of 1888 and demonstrated, at the small family birthday gathering around the table, a capacity for expressing her opinions that Mrs. Holt described as startling and Clem described as impressive and Dexter described, looking directly at Gertrude, as entirely unsurprising. Thomas was 9 and had decided his future was in cattle ranching and land management, and was already asking Dexter to explain contracts to him, which Dexter did without condescension and with evident pleasure. And Gertrude watched her son learning from his father and thought about her own father teaching her to read the act aloud before they signed it, and the way important things travel through time from one generation to the next in the form of attention paid to the right details. In the spring of 1889, when Oklahoma was opened for settlement under a new homestead rush and half of Kansas seemed to develop a sudden interest in moving south, Gertrude and Dexter sat on the porch of the Ramsey house in the evening and discussed it once, briefly and conclusively. "Are you tempted?" he asked. "No," she said. "Neither am I. This is where we built," she said. "This is where we are." He reached over and took her hand, the way he had been taking her hand since that afternoon in the south field in the mud, and they sat in the familiar evening quiet of Callen County, Kansas, and listened to Thomas inside explaining to June in considerable detail why Oklahoma was not as good as where they already lived, and June's voice coming back with a rebuttal that was, even at 5, not without logic. Warren Aldis retired in 1890, and was succeeded by a young lawyer named Henry Marsh, who had trained in Kansas City, and who came highly recommended, and who called on Gertrude in his first month of practice, because Aldis had told him specifically that she was the person to know in the eastern county if he wanted to understand how land law actually worked in practice. She sat across from him in the same office above the hardware store, where the sawdust and linseed smell had become part of her sense of what good work smelled like, and she spent 2 hours telling him the cases she had been involved with and what they had required, and where the pressure points were in the county system. And at the end of it he said, with the slightly stunned expression of a man who has received more information than he expected, "Mr. Aldis told me you were formidable." He did not fully convey the scope of it. "Warren Aldous is generous," she said. "He is accurate," Henry Marsh said. She worked with him as she had worked with Aldous, on a practical basis, when there was a case that needed handling, and she sent 2 more women to his office in the first year of his practice, and both of their claims were eventually resolved in their favor. The land office itself had, by 1890, a new head agent who was younger than Briggs and more careful about the law, partly because the federal oversight of county offices had increased since the inquiry of 1878, and partly because the new agent, a man named Dale Forsyth, had done his reading. He processed the paperwork for the Section 14 extension cleanly and on schedule, and she shook his hand across the same counter where Harmon Briggs had leaned and smirked, and she thought the world was capable of improvement if you were willing to be the friction it required. She was 38 years old in 1890, and she thought, on most days, that she was the best version of herself she had been, which was not to say she was finished becoming someone, but that the shape of who she was had grown clear, had settled into its outlines the way land settles after a long rain, deeply and truthfully. Thomas was 11 and June was 7, and in the evenings the Ramsey house was full of noise and argument, and the particular vitality that children bring to a house that was built for it. Mrs. Holt had begun to talk about retiring to Wichita where her sister lived, and they were already discussing who might replace her, a conversation that Mrs. Holt participated in from a position of strong opinion, because she had standards and intended them to be met. Clem and Dollars had moved their own small house to the edge of the Ramsey Range 3 years prior, tired of the distance they had previously kept, and Dollars had become the nearest thing to a sister Gertrude had ever had, and they visited with the comfortable frequency of people who know they are welcome. On a Sunday in late October of 1890, 12 years almost to the month from the October they were married, Dexter and Gertrude walked the boundary of the combined property together, as they did a few times each year, a slow walking inventory of what they had built and what it had cost and what it was worth. The autumn light was long and gold across the grass, the cottonwood trees in their yellow along the creek, the sky the deep clear blue of October in Kansas that she had come to love the way you love a thing that is simply itself, without apology or ornament. They walked the south boundary where the tracks she had feared had never come, because the railroad had found a different route further south, and then up along the creek bank and through the north pasture, and around to the original claim on Section 14, where the farmhouse stood solid on its stone foundation with the rose bush beside it, no longer blooming in October but green and established, a permanent feature. She stood at the center of the original claim and turned as she had turned that September morning in 1886, 4 years before, and the land was unchanged in its essential nature and changed in every particular, more fence and more building and more life in it than it had held when she first put her boots in its soil. Dexter stood beside her and looked with her. "Do you remember," she said, "the first time you saw this land?" "When I came to bring you the approval letter," he said. "May 1878, you were driving fence stakes. You were incredibly useful that day," she said. He laughed. It was the laugh she had fallen in love with, honest and unperformed, the one that came when something struck him as genuinely funny. "You said I was useful," he said. "That is the most romantic thing you have ever said to me." "It is not," she said, and she was laughing too. "It might be," he said. "From you, useful is practically a declaration." She turned to look at him. This man who was 42 years old and still lean, and still wore his hat the same way he had always worn it, and still looked at her with the same eyes he had turned on her outside the land office. The eyes that had no pity in them and no condescension, only a clear and genuine regard. "Then consider it declared," she said. He put his arm around her and she leaned into him, and they stood together in the middle of the land that was theirs in every sense of the word, the legal sense and the worked sense and the loved sense, and the prairie moved around them in the long October light, and she thought of everything it had taken to be standing exactly here and was glad, grateful and glad for all of it. Even the Tuesday, even the laughter, maybe especially the Tuesday, maybe especially the laughter. Because the laughter had been the thing that sent her out that door and onto the sidewalk and into the extraordinary ordinary morning, where a man named Dexter Ramsey was leaning against a post with dark eyes and 4 days of beard and 2 words that turned out to be the beginning of the rest of everything. Come with me. She had come. And this was where it had brought her, to this exact meridian of October light and good land and a life so full, and so hers that sometimes in the mornings she stood in it for a moment before starting work just to make sure it was real. It always was. Every time, it always was. They walked back to the Ramsey house in the last of the afternoon light, with the dry grass making its autumn sound around them, and the first stars coming up in the east, and from inside the house, the sound of Thomas's voice arguing with June about something that required significant volume, and Mrs. Holt's voice rising over both of them with the authority of someone who has been managing the situation since before either of those children was born. Dexter held the door open. She went in. The house was warm and loud and smelled of the supper Mrs. Holt had left on the stove, and Thomas came immediately to tell them the nature of the argument with June, who came immediately after to correct his account of it, and they both spoke at once with the passionate inaccuracy of siblings, and Dexter listened with judicial gravity to both sides, and said the matter would need to be addressed after supper because supper first was the rule, and both children accepted this because Dexter's rules, when he made them, were made in a tone that made the word rule unnecessary. She served the supper and they sat together at the table, the 4 of them, and the conversation ran from Thomas's school and June's current project, which involved the cataloging of every rock on the property, and which Gertrude was starting to believe was actually a genuine interest rather than a phase, to the cattle and the creek level, and whether the south field would need the drainage tiles looked at in the spring. After supper, while the children were in bed and the house was finally quiet, she sat at the kitchen table with the lamp and a cup of tea and the land records she was reviewing for a spring planting plan, and Dexter sat across from her with the ranch accounts he reviewed on Sunday evenings, and there was no sound but the scratch of their respective pens and the occasional shift of the house settling in the cooling night air. She did not look up from her work. He did not look up from his. But at some point she felt him watching her, the specific warm attention she had known since the beginning, and she looked up and he was, in fact, watching her with the expression that had no performance in it, the one she had seen in the south field and in the barn and at the dance in the summer yard, the one that was simply what he felt without editorial comment. "What?" she said. "Nothing," he said. "Just you." She looked back at her land records. Outside, the Kansas prairie spread dark and enormous and permanently indifferent to human plans, which was what she had always loved about it. Its honesty, its refusal to make promises it could not keep. It simply was what it was, and it rewarded exactly the work you gave it and not 1 ounce more. She had given it everything she had. It had given everything back. So had he. So had this life she had built from a Tuesday and a laughter she refused to let stop her, and a man at a fence post who meant what he said. She picked up her pen and continued her work, and the lamp burned steadily between them, and outside the October stars were enormous over Callen County, and inside everything was exactly as it should be.